Hey everyone, tonight we're starting with something darker than usual. Make yourself comfortable, dim the lights, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our community from all over the world. Tonight's story isn't about begging for mercy, it's about a woman with 13 days left to live, who understood something most people facing death never grasp. You can lose the battle and still win the war. May 6th, 1536, Tower of London. A woman sits with ink-stained fingers and a quill, writing to her husband. Her husband, the man who broke England apart to marry her, the man who defied the Pope, created a new church and executed his best friend just to make her his wife. Also, the man who ordered her execution. Anne Boleyn has 13 days left to live. She knows it. Everyone knows it. The trials are scheduled. The executioner has already been summoned from France, an expert swordsman paid in advance. But Anne isn't writing to beg for her life. She's writing to Henry VIII, and every word is calculated. Every phrase serves multiple purposes, because what Henry doesn't know, what no one in 1536 understands, is that this letter isn't really for him. It's for us, 500 years later. Anne Boleyn is playing chess with history itself, and her opening move is brilliant. She barely mentions herself at all. Forget everything you think you know. Anne Boleyn wasn't some blonde seductress who bewitched a king. She was dark-haired, dark-eyed, and by Tudor standards, not even that beautiful. Contemporary descriptions called her pleasant-looking, which in 1530s England was basically saying, "She's fine, I guess." What Anne had was something far more dangerous than beauty. She was terrifyingly intelligent, fluent French, could read Latin, educated at the French court where she learned music, dance, poetry, and how to navigate the deadliest political landscape in Europe. She could debate theology with bishops and win. She played the lute, composed music, and discussed Protestant Reformation ideas at a time when women weren't supposed to have opinions about literally anything. In a world where most women couldn't read, Anne Boleyn could argue scripture with the clergy. That's what killed her, by the way. Not adultery, not treason, not even failing to produce a male heir. She was too smart, too outspoken, and too unwilling to shut up. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about how this woman with no royal blood, no massive fortune, and no conventional beauty managed to make a king tear apart an entire country just to marry her. Around 1526, Henry VIII notices Anne Boleyn at court. He's already married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor. They've been married 17 years. Catherine has given him one surviving child, Mary, a daughter. Henry needs a son, not wants, needs. The Tudor dynasty is barely 40 years old, won through civil war. If Henry dies without a male heir, England descends into chaos again. Women can't rule. Everyone knows that. It would mean foreign invasion, civil war, the end of everything. So Henry looks for a younger wife. Anne Boleyn is in her mid-20s, sharp-tongued, educated, and critically, not interested in being his mistress. See, Henry had already slept with Anne's sister Mary. The whole court knew. Mary Boleyn had been Henry's mistress for years, until he got bored and discarded her like used clothing. Anne watched this and learned. When Henry came sniffing around, Anne said no. This was insane. You didn't refuse the king. But Anne understood Henry better than anyone. He loved the chase. Plenty of women threw themselves at him. What he'd never had was a woman who challenged him, debated with him, refused him, made him work for it. Anne became Henry's obsession. For 7 years they played this game. Henry pursued. Anne refused. Henry wrote desperate love letters. 17 survive, and they're pathetic. A king reduced to begging. Anne held firm. Marriage or nothing. And slowly, impossibly, Henry began to believe he could make it happen. To marry Anne, Henry needed his marriage to Catherine annulled. Not divorce. Annulment means the marriage never existed. Henry argued that marrying his dead brother's widow violated biblical law. so the marriage was never valid. One problem: the Pope had already approved that marriage back in 1509. Henry was asking the Pope to admit a previous Pope was wrong. The Pope refused. So Henry did something unprecedented. He broke with the Catholic Church entirely. Let that sink in. A king restructured his country's entire religious system, defied the most powerful institution in the world, risked excommunication and invasion, created the Church of England with himself as head, tore his kingdom apart for one woman. People died for this, monks executed, monasteries burned. Sir Thomas More, Henry's close friend, beheaded for refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the church. All for Anne Boleyn. January 1533, they marry in secret. Anne is already pregnant. On September 7th, 1533, she gives birth at Greenwich Palace to a daughter, Elizabeth. Imagine being Anne in that moment. 7 years of waiting, 7 years of pressure, an entire country torn apart to make your marriage possible. Catholic Europe calling you a whore and a heretic, and you fail to deliver the one thing everyone expects. Henry is devastated. The celebrations planned for a prince quietly cancelled. Documents announcing the birth of a prince hastily edited. You can still see where someone added an S to turn prince into princess. But it's okay. They're young. There will be more children, except there aren't. Anne gets pregnant in 1534. Miscarriage. Pregnant again in 1535. Miscarriage. January 29th, 1536. The day Catherine of Aragon is buried. Anne miscarries again. A boy, about 15 weeks along. That miscarriage signs her death warrant. Henry tells his courtiers he'd been seduced by witchcraft and God is showing his displeasure. Translation: Henry wants out and he's already found his next wife, Jane Seymour. Quiet, submissive, pale, blonde. Everything Anne isn't. By early 1536, Anne has enemies everywhere. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, had been Anne's ally. They'd worked together to dismantle the monasteries, but by 1536, they're bitter rivals fighting over monastery wealth. Anne wants it for education and charity. Cromwell wants it for the king's treasury and his own pockets. Anne makes a mistake. She tells Cromwell publicly that she'd like to see his head off his shoulders. Cromwell remembers. Cromwell had watched Anne help destroy Cardinal Wolsey. He knows she's capable of orchestrating a minister's downfall, so he decides to orchestrate hers first. The Catholic faction at court hates Anne for everything she represents. She's the reason England broke with Rome. She's why Princess Mary was declared illegitimate. She's Protestant, educated, French-influenced, everything they despise. The Spanish ambassador sees Anne as an obstacle to diplomatic relations. With Anne gone, England and the Empire can reconcile, and Henry himself wants out. He's 44, running out of time for sons, convinced his marriage to Anne is cursed by God. He's fallen for Jane Seymour. Thomas Cromwell watches the king grow cold toward his wife. He sees the signs, and Cromwell understands if he can destroy Anne before she destroys him, he survives. If he fails, he's dead. So he builds a case. April 30th, 1536. A court musician named Mark Smeaton is arrested. Mark is lowborn, not a gentleman, just talented at lute and dance. He's risen through court on skill alone. He's also the most vulnerable person Cromwell could target. What happens to Mark in custody is lost to history. But within 24 hours, he confesses to adultery with the Queen. Tudor law doesn't technically allow torture without royal permission, but there are other methods. Psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, showing someone the instruments and describing what will happen to their body. Telling them confession saves them while maintaining innocence means agony. Whatever Cromwell's men do to Mark Smeaton, it works. With that confession, Cromwell has his thread. May 1st, 1536. The May Day jousting tournament at Greenwich. Henry loves jousts. He watches from the royal box beside Anne. 4 men are competing. Sir Henry Norris, one of Henry's closest friends, Sir Francis Weston, Sir William Brereton, others. Anne is watching. She has no idea Mark Smeaton has been arrested. She doesn't know Cromwell has already written up charges. Then Henry receives a message. He goes pale, stands abruptly, leaves without a word to Anne, mounts his horse and rides straight to Westminster with only 6 companions. Anne knows immediately something is catastrophically wrong. As Henry rides away, he takes Sir Henry Norris with him. The 2 men ride together, and Henry interrogates Norris the entire way, promises him pardon if he'll confess to adultery with the Queen. Norris refuses, says he'd rather die 1,000 deaths than falsely accuse her. Henry arrests him at Westminster. Anne spends May 1st in terror. What happened? What did she do? She doesn't sleep. The next morning, May 2nd, 1536, Privy Council members arrive at Greenwich. Anne is under arrest for adultery, incest, and high treason. Her brother George is already in custody. They take her by barge to the Tower of London, the same route she'd taken 3 years earlier for her coronation, when the river was filled with decorated boats and musicians. This time, the river is empty. The Tower isn't her palace anymore. It's her prison. The Tower of London in 1536 is a fortress, a palace, a prison, and an execution ground, all in one. Anne is brought through the river entrance. William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, is waiting. Anne's first words, "Mr. Kingston, do I go into a dungeon?" "No, madam. You shall go into the lodging you lay in at your coronation." It's not kindness, it's strategy. Put the Queen in royal apartments, make her feel secure. Maybe she gets careless and says something incriminating. Kingston watches constantly and reports everything to Cromwell. Anne talks. A lot. She's hysterical at first, laughing and crying simultaneously, swinging between defiant innocence and confused questioning. She demands to know where her brother is. Where's her father? Why was she arrested? Kingston writes it all down. The King's Council will be here, and then I shall know more. But I think much unkindness in the King to put such about me as I have never loved. Translation. Henry has placed hostile women as her attendants, ladies who hate her, who will report everything, who will twist her words. Even in shock, Anne understands this is a trap. Between April 30th and May 5th, 5 men are arrested. Mark Smeaton, who's already confessed, Sir Henry Norris, groom of the stool, and Henry's close friend, who refuses to confess despite promises of pardon. Sir Francis Weston, young gentleman of the Privy Chamber, maintains innocence. Sir William Brereton, another gentleman, maintains innocence. And George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, Anne's own brother, charged with incest. The charges are absurd. Cromwell's indictment lists specific dates and locations. Modern historians have proven Anne wasn't even in the same location as several of these men on the dates specified. She was constantly attended by ladies in waiting. A queen having secret affairs with 5 different men would require a massive conspiracy of silence among dozens of servants, all of whom would face execution if the truth came out. But the charges aren't meant to be believable. They're meant to be legal. Adultery by a queen is treason because it could put a bastard on the throne. Plotting the king's death is treason. Cromwell charges Anne with both, adultery with 5 men and conspiring with them to murder Henry so she could marry Henry Norris afterward. With treason charges, execution is mandatory. No annulment, no banishment, just death. The trials are scheduled fast. May 12th, 4 commoners tried at Westminster. May 15th, Anne and George tried at the Tower. May 17th, the 4 men executed. May 19th, Anne executed, from arrest to execution, 17 days. May 6th, 1536, 4 days after arrest, 6 days before the first trial, 13 days before execution. Anne sits down to write. She has ink, parchment, and nothing else. She's been told she'll face trial. She knows the charges. She's smart enough to understand this is political execution dressed as justice. And she writes to the one person who can save her, Henry VIII. Except she doesn't believe he'll save her. What she believes is that this letter will outlive her, that centuries later, people will read her words and understand what really happened. Anne Boleyn is playing for posterity. Let's read it. I'll show you sections, then dissect what she's really saying, because every word is calculated. This isn't begging, it's a masterclass in political strategy written by a woman with nothing left except her legacy. Sir, your grace's displeasure and my imprisonment are things so strange unto me, as what to write or what to excuse, I am altogether ignorant. She opens with confusion. Not these terrible charges or this injustice. She frames it as Henry being displeased with her, like she failed to please him rather than committed crimes. Things so strange, emphasizing the surreal nature. One day queen, next day imprisoned for treason. Whereas you send unto me, willing me to confess a truth, and so to obtain favour by such a one, whom you know to be my professed enemy. Here she gets sharp. Henry sent someone to interrogate her and pressure her to confess. Someone Anne calls my professed enemy. She's calling out that her interrogators aren't neutral. They want her dead. She's telling Henry, I see what you're doing. I see Cromwell's fingerprints. I'm not stupid. I no sooner received this message by him than I rightly conceived your meaning. I rightly conceived your meaning. I understood immediately this is a setup. She's not begging. She's analysing the political situation and letting Henry know she sees through it. And if, as you say, confessing a truth indeed may procure my safety, I shall with all willingness and duty perform your command. She's offering to confess. Except wait, but let not your grace ever imagine that your poor wife will ever be brought to acknowledge a fault where never not so much as a thought thereof ever proceeded. This is brilliant. If confessing would save me, I'd do it, but I will never confess because I didn't do anything wrong, not even in thought. She constructs a rhetorical trap. She appears submissive while being completely defiant. If she just says, I'm innocent, repeatedly, she sounds defensive. If she frames it as don't imagine I'm guilty, she's asking Henry for trust. While proclaiming innocence, it's the only move she has. Confess and damn herself, refuse and be disobedient. So she does both simultaneously. Pure genius. And to speak a truth, never prince had wife more loyal in all duty and true affection than you have ever found in Anne Boleyn, with which name and place I could willingly have contented myself, if God and your grace's pleasure had so been pleased. Break this down. Never prince had wife more loyal, asserting innocence directly. If she'd committed adultery with 5 men including her brother, she couldn't claim to be the most loyal wife ever. With which name and place I could willingly have contented myself. She's reminding Henry she never asked to be queen. He pursued her for 7 years. He broke with Rome for her. He tore England apart. This was his obsession, his choice. Notice, she signs Anne Boleyn, her maiden name, not Anne the Queen. She's going back to the woman Henry fell in love with, before crowns and politics and pressure for male heirs. It's calculated emotional appeal, disguised as casual signature. But if you have already determined of me, and that not only my death, but an infamous slander must bring you the enjoying of your desired happiness, then I desire of God that he will pardon your great sins herein. Devastating. If you have already determined of me, you've decided I'm guilty. This isn't a real trial. Not only my death, but an infamous slander. You're not just killing me, you're destroying my reputation to feel justified. Must bring you the enjoying of your desired happiness. There's another woman, isn't there, Henry? We all know who she is. Then I desire of God that he will pardon your great sins herein. You're committing murder, and you'll answer to God. She invokes divine judgment against the king killing her, and she does it without directly accusing him of anything that could be used against her. Everything is hypotheticals and prayers. Legal protection while moral condemnation. My last and only request shall be that myself may only bear the burden of your grace's displeasure, and that it may not touch the innocent souls of those poor gentlemen whom, as I understand, are likewise in strait imprisonment for my sake. She's not begging for her own life. She's begging for theirs. She calls them innocent souls, proclaiming their innocence, and by extension, hers. For my sake, they're imprisoned because of false accusations about her. This achieves multiple goals. It makes her look noble, more concerned with others than herself. It asserts everyone's innocence indirectly. It creates sympathy. And most importantly, it protects the families of these men, who might later support Elizabeth. Anne isn't thinking about herself. She's thinking about Elizabeth's future. These men have families with power and influence. If Anne can get them pardoned, their families remember she tried. They might protect Elizabeth. Try me, good king, but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and judges. Yet let me receive an open trial, for my truth shall fear no open shame. Direct challenge. Give me a real trial. Not this show trial with my enemies as judges. Public courts where everyone can hear the evidence, because I'm innocent. She knows Henry won't do this. The charges are too flimsy. In a genuine trial with unbiased judges, she'd have a chance. But by demanding it, she exposes the sham. Historians 500 years later immediately understand. She wasn't given a fair trial. She asked for one and was denied. From my doleful prison in the Tower 6th May, your most loyal and ever faithful wife, Anne Boleyn. My doleful prison, emphasising unjust imprisonment. Your most loyal and ever faithful wife. If she'd committed adultery with 5 men, she wouldn't be most loyal and ever faithful. The signature itself declares innocence. Anne Boleyn, not Anne the Queen, just Anne Boleyn. Going back to basics, reminding Henry who she was before the crown, before the pressure, before everything went wrong. Anne barely mentions her daughter. One oblique reference. Neither let that stain, that unworthy stain of a disloyal heart towards your good grace, ever rest so foul a blot on your most dutiful wife and the infant princess your daughter. That's it. One phrase. Why? Because any direct emotional manipulation about Elizabeth could backfire. If Anne writes, "Please think of our daughter, she needs her mother," Henry might see manipulation. He might get angry. He might take it out on Elizabeth later. So Anne protects Elizabeth by barely mentioning her. She reminds Henry Elizabeth exists, that Elizabeth is his daughter, that the stain on Anne's reputation affects Elizabeth. Then she moves on. The silence itself is protective. The less Anne says, the less ammunition Henry has. Every word Anne doesn't write is as calculated as every word she does. The letter Anne wrote on May 6, 1536, almost certainly never reached Henry. It was found in Thomas Cromwell's papers after Cromwell's execution in 1540. Either Cromwell intercepted it, knowing it might sway Henry emotionally, or Henry read it, felt nothing, and tossed it where Cromwell retrieved it. Or Henry read it, crumpled it, and tried to forget it existed. We'll never know. What we know, it didn't save Anne. May 12, 1536. 4 men tried at Westminster Hall. Norris, Weston, Brereton, Smeaton. Only Smeaton maintains his confession. The other 3 insist on innocence. All 4 convicted. Verdict predetermined. May 15, 1536. King's Hall in the Tower of London. 2,000 spectators packed the hall. Anne's trial is the highest profile in English history to that point. The jury includes her former boyfriend. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, sits among the judges. He's the man Anne was in love with before Henry. Their relationship broken up years earlier because Percy was engaged to someone else, and Anne wasn't noble enough. Now Percy has to condemn the woman he once loved to death. He'll collapse when the verdict is read. He'll die of illness 8 months later. Some historians think he never recovered. The jury includes Henry's best friend. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, hates Anne. He's Catholic faction, loyal to Catherine of Aragon's memory. He's been waiting for this, and the trial is presided over by Anne's own uncle. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, is Anne's uncle. He's also a pragmatist who knows Boleyn family survival depends on cutting Anne loose. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, sits on the Privy Council and says nothing in her defence. family is expendable when the king wants blood. The indictment is graphic, specific, designed to humiliate. It accuses Anne of adultery with 5 men on specific dates in specific locations. It describes her procuring and inciting her own natural brother to violate her in incest. It accuses her of mocking the king, saying he had neither skill or virility in bed, and plotting his death so she could marry Henry Norris. Every detail calculated to destroy not just her life, but her reputation forever. Anne stands on a raised platform in the centre of the hall, visible to everyone, and listens to these obscene lies read out loud to 2,000 people. She doesn't flinch. When Anne speaks, observers are shocked by her composure. One account says she gave wise and discreet answers to all things laid against her. Another says she made so wise and discreet answers to all things laid against her, excusing herself with her words so clearly, as though she had never been faulty to the same. She systematically dismantles every charge, points out absurdity of dates and locations, explains impossibility of committing these acts while constantly attended by ladies in waiting, refutes the accusation she mocked the king's sexual performance, designed specifically to enrage Henry and make reconciliation impossible. None of it matters. The verdict was decided before the trial began. Henry sent Jane Seymour a message the morning of Anne's trial, promising she'd hear news at 3 o'clock of the condemnation of the putain, French for whore. He'd already told Jane Anne would be convicted by 3 p.m. The trial starts at 1 p.m. Every single one of the 26 peers votes guilty, even Anne's uncle, even the men who knew the charges were false, even Henry Percy, who collapses immediately after. The sentence: death by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Burning was traditional for women convicted of treason. Beheading was more merciful, reserved for nobility. Henry, in his great mercy, chooses beheading. But here's the sick part. Henry has already sent for a special executioner from France, an expert swordsman from Calais who uses a sword instead of the crude English axe. The executioner has already been summoned, paid en route to England, before Anne's trial even starts. This proves the entire trial was theatre. Henry decided Anne would die by French, sword before she ever defended herself. 2 days after Anne's trial, May 17th, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who owes his entire career to Anne, who supported Henry's annulment from Catherine, who crowned Anne Queen, holds a secret hearing. He declares Henry's marriage to Anne was never valid. The grounds? Probably the sexual relationship Henry had with Anne's sister Mary years earlier. Under church law, that creates affinity, making marriage to Anne technically incestuous, similar to the argument used to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine. Here's the problem. If the marriage was never valid, how could Anne commit adultery as queen? You can't be guilty of adultery in a marriage that never existed. You can't commit treason as queen if you were never queen. And Elizabeth, if the marriage wasn't valid, Elizabeth is illegitimate with no claim to the throne. The annulment exposes the entire proceeding as logically absurd and politically motivated. Henry wants Anne dead, marriage erased, freedom to marry Jane, and Elizabeth removed from succession, all in one move. The law twists itself into pretzels to give him everything. May 17th, 1536. 2 days after Anne's trial, 2 days before her execution, 5 men are taken from the Tower to Tower Hill for public execution. 4 of them are completely innocent. Mark Smeaton is the only one who confessed. Court musician, talented at lute and virginals, good dancer, handsome. From nothing. No family wealth, no title, no connections, just skill and charm. Exactly the kind of person Cromwell could break. What happened to Mark between April 30 and May 1st is unknown. But here's what we know about Tudor interrogation. You don't need literal torture. You threaten, show them the instruments, describe in vivid detail what happens to their body if they don't cooperate. Tell them confessing saves them. You lie. Mark was in Cromwell's custody about 24 hours. When he emerged, he'd confessed to adultery with the Queen. He was the foundation of Cromwell's case. Without Smeaton's confession, there's no case. Just court gossip. May 17th, Mark is taken to Tower Hill. He repeats his confession publicly before he dies, likely because he still believes the promise of mercy, or because he's threatened his mother will be arrested if he recants. He's beheaded, body buried in Tower Churchyard, remembered in history as the man whose coerced confession murdered a queen and 4 innocent men. Sir Henry Norris is one of Henry's most trusted companions. As groom of the stool, which sounds undignified but was actually one of the most powerful positions at court, Norris is responsible for the king's most intimate needs and has constant access to Henry. He's in his 40s, wealthy, well-connected, respected. The charges stem from court gossip. Anne had apparently joked with Norris about marrying her if Henry died. Flirtation, banter, standard courtly love games. Cromwell twisted it into conspiracy to murder the king. On the ride from Greenwich to Westminster, after Henry abandoned Anne at the May Day tournament, Henry personally interrogates Norris, promises him full pardon if he'll confess. Norris refuses, says he'd rather die 1,000 deaths than falsely accuse the Queen. That refusal dooms him. May 17th, Norris is executed on Tower Hill. To the end, he maintains Anne's innocence and his own. His property confiscated by the Crown. His family loses everything. Sir Francis Weston is young, only about 25. From wealthy family, good-looking, charming, part of the younger generation of courtiers. The evidence against him? He'd been part of conversations with Anne that included flirtation and jokes. He'd apparently told Anne he loved her more than his own wife. Courtly love rhetoric, performative romance considered entertainment, not real passion. Cromwell turned it into adultery. Weston's family tries desperately to save him. They offer money, lands, anything. Weston's father sends letter after letter begging for his son's life. Doesn't matter. The trials are too quick, verdicts predetermined. Weston executed May 17th, maintaining innocence, family financially ruined trying to save him. Sir William Brereton is from powerful Welsh family, gentleman of the Privy Chamber, wealthy, well-connected. The charges against him are vaguest of all. Essentially, he was around Anne at court, therefore he must have slept with her. That's it. That's the entire case. Modern historians think Brereton might have been targeted because of Welsh political rivalries. Cromwell had enemies among Brereton's family and allies. Taking down Brereton wasn't about Anne. It was removing a political rival while opportunity presented itself. Brereton maintains complete innocence, refuses to confess, even under threat of torture. Executed May 17th. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, is Anne's younger brother. About 32, married unhappily to Jane Parker, scholar, diplomat, one of Henry's favourite jousting companions. He's charged with incest, specifically committing incest with Anne on multiple occasions, including once at Whitehall Palace, where Anne put her tongue in his mouth. The charge is grotesque, designed to maximise horror and disgust. The evidence? His wife Jane Parker allegedly provided testimony suggesting improper closeness between Anne and George. She later denies saying anything incriminating. Too late. At George's trial, he's handed a piece of paper and told not to read it aloud. It contains the accusation that Anne told him Henry was impotent and not good in bed. George reads it aloud anyway. He knows it'll enrage Henry and doom any chance of pardon. But he also knows he's already dead, so he might as well force the accusation into public record to show how absurd the charges are. George gives the best defence of anyone at the trials, eloquent, passionate, systematic in dismantling every accusation. Observers are moved, doesn't matter. George convicted, sentenced to death. May 17th, George Boleyn taken to Tower Hill. His final words are dignified and careful. He admits to being a sinner in general as all people are, but maintains innocence of specific charges. He's being cautious, trying not to say anything that could be used against his family or Anne. He's beheaded. Anne watches from her window in the tower as the men are led to execution. She can hear the crowds. She knows what's happening. 4 innocent men and 1 coerced confessor die because Thomas Cromwell needed a scandal big enough to destroy a queen, and Henry VIII needed an exit strategy from a marriage that hadn't given him sons. May 18th, 1536. Anne has 1 day left. She spends it preparing for death, not just in prayer, though she prays constantly, but in strategic thinking. Because even now, even with less than 24 hours remaining, Anne Boleyn is playing political chess. Anne writes another letter, not to Henry this time. That attempt failed. This one is to Matthew Parker, her chaplain, a man she trusts completely. The letter doesn't survive, but Parker later describes its contents to Elizabeth after she becomes queen. Anne asks Parker to watch over Elizabeth, to protect her, to guide her education, to be there for her daughter when Anne can't be. It's a mother's final act, ensuring her child has someone who will look out for her. Parker keeps his promise. When Elizabeth becomes queen in 1558, she appoints Matthew Parker as Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the most powerful positions in England. He serves her for 17 years until his death. Anne's final political move, securing a trusted ally for her daughter, pays off 22 years later. Anne chooses her clothing carefully. She'll wear dark grey damask gown over crimson taffeta with ermine-trimmed cloak. The colours are strategic. Dark grey is sombre, appropriate for death. But the crimson underneath, that's royal. That's power. That's a reminder she's Queen of England, even now. The ermine is worn only by royalty. It's a statement. I am anointed and crowned, and you're executing me anyway. She has her hair cut shorter so it won't interfere with the sword. She selects a hood to cover her hair on the scaffold. She'll be blindfolded, but the hood is important. Modesty, dignity, queenly bearing even in death. Anne is staging her own execution, like theatrical performance. She knows hundreds will watch. She knows the story will spread. She understands her final words and appearance will define how history remembers her. Anne jokes with Kingston the night before. She puts her hands around her neck and laughs. I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck. Black humour facing death. She's either completely hysterical or demonstrating extraordinary courage. Probably both. She asks Kingston if she'll feel much pain. He assures her it'll be quick. The French swordsman is an expert. Anne jokes again. I have seen many men, and also women executed, and that they have been in great sorrow. I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck. She keeps repeating the bit about her little neck. Dark mantra. Kingston writes everything down. Later, people read these accounts and debate. Was Anne breaking down or staying strong? Was she losing her mind or maintaining dignity? I think she was doing both, laughing because the alternative is screaming, joking because it's the only power she has left. Execution scheduled for 9 a.m. May 19th, 1536. But it doesn't happen at 9 a.m. The executioner is delayed. No one tells Anne why. She waits, mentally prepared to die, and then nothing. This happens multiple times throughout the morning. False alarms, delays. Anne prepares herself emotionally for death, then has to unprepare, then prepare again. Historians call these delays intentionally sadistic false starts. Someone, probably Cromwell, is deliberately torturing Anne by making her face death multiple times. Psychological warfare. By the time actual execution happens, Anne has died a dozen times in her mind. Finally, around 9 a.m, accounts differ on exact timing, Anne is told it's time. She walks from her chambers in the Queen's house to the scaffold on Tower Green. Tower Green is inside the Tower of London complex. Private execution, not public like the men had at Tower Hill. Only about 1,000 carefully selected spectators present, mostly nobles and officials. Henry doesn't attend. He's already left London. He's with Jane Seymour. Anne walks steadily, calm, composed. Her ladies walk behind, weeping. The scaffold is draped in black. Low platform, only about 4 feet high. In the centre, a block covered in straw, except there's no block actually. The French method doesn't use chopping block. Anne will kneel upright, and the swordsman will take her head off, from behind in one stroke. Anne steps onto the scaffold, every eye watching. She's required to give final speech. Tudor execution protocol. Condemned must acknowledge the law. Thank the king for being merciful in execution method. Ask forgiveness for sins. Request prayers. Any deviation could bring consequences on your family. Anne knows this. She knows Elizabeth's future depends on saying the right things. So she does. She speaks calmly, clearly, with steady voice. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. According to the law, and by the law, she's following the formula, accepting sentence as legally valid, even though everyone present knows it's political murder. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die, but I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord. This is the part that haunts. A gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, said about the man executing her based on fabricated charges. To me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord, about the husband killing her to marry another woman. Is this sincere, ironic, protection for Elizabeth? Definitely the last one. Whatever else Anne is feeling, she's protecting her daughter with every word. Any criticism of Henry would mark Elizabeth as daughter of traitor who cursed the king on scaffold. So Anne praises him, calls him merciful, gentle, good. It must have tasted like poison. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world, and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. I require them to judge the best. As close as Anne comes to asserting innocence, she's asking people to judge her kindly, to think the best of her, to question the verdict. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul. Standard closing. Commending soul to God. Then Anne does something unexpected. She speaks in French. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. French was the language of her youth. Language she spoke at French court. Language of her education and sophistication. She's dying as she lived, educated, cultured, unbroken. Anne removes her hood, removes her ermine cloak. Her ladies help. She's blindfolded with white cloth. She kneels upright in the straw, repeating, To Jesus Christ I commend my soul, over and over, hands clasped in prayer. The French executioner, Jean Rambaud, though his name is disputed, has hidden his sword under the straw. He's removed his shoes so he can move silently. This is brilliant psychology. Anne won't hear him approach. She won't tense up. She'll never know the exact moment. As Anne prays, the executioner shouts, Bring me the sword, looking away from her toward the crowd. Anne's head turns instinctively toward the sound. In that split second, the executioner raises the hidden sword and takes her head off in one clean stroke. Multiple eyewitness accounts say Anne's lips moved for several minutes after decapitation. Her eyes blinked. This is actually documented with other beheadings too. The brain doesn't die instantly when severed from the body. For a few seconds or minutes, consciousness may remain. The crowd is silent, stunned. Many can't process what just happened for several seconds. It was so fast, so clean, so surreal. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, is dead. She's 35 years old. She's been queen for 3 years. She's been Henry's obsession for 10. And now she's gone. Here's how much thought Henry gave to Anne's final resting place. None. No coffin prepared, No ceremony planned, no burial arrangements made. Anne's ladies frantically search for something to put her body in. They find an old elm arrow chest, box used to store arrows, not even properly sized for a human body. They place Anne's body in the chest. They place her severed head at her feet because it doesn't fit properly otherwise. A crowned and anointed Queen of England is buried in an arrow chest because her husband couldn't be bothered to order a coffin. She's buried in unmarked grave in Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, St. Peter in chains, inside the tower. The chapel floor is already crowded with bodies from previous executions. Anne is squeezed in wherever there's space. No marker, no memorial, no acknowledgement a queen is buried there. Her brother George is buried nearby, also unmarked. Not until Victorian times is Anne's grave located and properly marked. In 1876, when the chapel is renovated, they find remains believed to be Anne's. Small framed woman with small head, buried in correct location. The bones are reinterred in chapel floor with marker. But in 1536, Anne disappears into unmarked grave and is meant to be forgotten. May 30th, 1536, 11 days after Anne's execution. Henry VIII marries Jane Seymour in private ceremony at York Place, soon to be renamed Whitehall Palace. 11 days. He didn't even wait 2 weeks. No pretense of mourning, no period of respect. He just moves on like Anne never existed. Jane Seymour wears white. She's quiet, demure, obedient. Her motto is bound to obey and serve, opposite of Anne's the most happy. Henry is delighted. She's everything Anne wasn't. Compliant, conservative, from family with history of producing sons. Her brother Edward Seymour would become one of Henry's most powerful advisors. Jane represents fresh start, no controversy, no Protestant radicalism, no sharp tongue or political opinions. Just nice, quiet, fertile young woman who'll give him the son he desperately needs. And amazingly, she does. October 12th, 1537, year and a half after marrying Henry, Jane Seymour gives birth to a son, Edward. Henry finally has his male heir. The problem? Jane dies 12 days later from puerperal fever, likely caused by retained placenta and infection. Henry is devastated. Of all his wives, Jane is the one he remembers most fondly. She gave him what he wanted, a son, and died before she could disappoint him, or make him angry, or fail to produce more children. Jane gets to be the perfect wife because she died before Henry could destroy her too. Edward, the son Henry wanted so desperately, the reason Anne and Catherine were destroyed, becomes Edward VI. He's crowned at age 9 when Henry dies in 1547. Edward rules for 6 years and dies at age 15 of tuberculosis. All that destruction, all those dead women, all the religious upheaval, for a sickly boy who reigned 6 years and died young. Meanwhile, the daughter Henry desperately didn't want, Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's child, goes on to rule England for 45 years in one of the greatest reigns in English history. Irony doesn't even begin to cover it. Elizabeth Tudor, born September 7th, 1533, not quite 3 years old when her mother is executed. Henry declares her a bastard immediately after Anne's death. The annulment means Elizabeth is illegitimate. She's removed from line of succession. No longer Princess Elizabeth, demoted to Lady Elizabeth. Her household disbanded, her servants dismissed. She's sent away from court to live in various country houses, often in near poverty, because Henry doesn't properly fund her household. Elizabeth is forbidden from speaking about her mother. Anne's name becomes toxic. For most of Elizabeth's childhood and adolescence, mentioning Anne Boleyn is dangerous, could get you executed for treason. Elizabeth learns early to never speak of her mother, to pretend she doesn't remember, to act as if Anne never existed. But Elizabeth never forgets. After Elizabeth's death in 1603, they removed jewellery from her body. Among the items is locket ring Elizabeth wore from around 1575 until her death, nearly 30 years. The ring is designed so it can only be opened by breaking a hidden spring mechanism. When they finally open it centuries later, they find two enamel miniature portraits inside. One of Elizabeth herself, one of Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth wore her mother's portrait against her skin for 30 years, hidden in a ring no one else could open. That ring tells you everything about how Elizabeth felt. In public, she couldn't acknowledge Anne. In private, she carried Anne every day. There are other signs. Elizabeth keeps Anne's Book of Hours, her prayer book, with Anne's inscription, Le temps viendra, Joanne Boleyn. The time will come, I, Anne Boleyn. A prophecy Elizabeth's reign fulfilled. She displays tapestries and objects connected to Anne in her private chambers, where court gossips can't reach. When Elizabeth appoints Matthew Parker as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1558, it's because Anne asked Parker to watch over Elizabeth in her final letter. And Elizabeth never marries. Historians debate why, but one reason is almost certainly what she witnessed about marriage to a king, meaning vulnerability, loss of autonomy, and potentially death. Elizabeth learned from her mother's fate. She would be queen on her own terms, or not at all. In 1543, when Elizabeth is 10, Henry VIII passes the Third Succession Act, restoring both Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, and Elizabeth to line of succession. They're still technically illegitimate, both their mothers' marriages having been annulled, but Henry wants to ensure that if Edward dies without children, there's clear succession line. The order, Edward first as legitimate son, then Mary, then Elizabeth. This is the only reason Elizabeth ever becomes queen. If Henry hadn't restored her to succession, Elizabeth would have died in obscurity as bastard daughter of executed traitor. When Henry dies in 1547, 9-year-old Edward becomes king. Elizabeth is 13. Edward is raised as strict Protestant. He's educated, intelligent, but sickly. By 1553, it's clear he's dying of tuberculosis. The problem? Next in line is Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, who's Catholic. Edward and his Protestant advisors are terrified Mary will reverse the Reformation and return England to Catholicism. So, they try to bypass Mary's claim. They convince Edward to name Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, as his successor instead. Edward dies July 6, 1553. Jane Grey is proclaimed queen. She reigns 9 days before Mary gathers support, overthrows Jane, and claims the throne. Jane Grey is later executed. She's 16 or 17 years old, another young woman destroyed by Tudor politics. Mary becomes Mary Eyes, Bloody Mary to Protestant historians. Mary is Catholic, devout, determined to return England to Rome and undo her father's Protestant Reformation. She begins executing Protestants. Hundreds die, burned at the stake for heresy, hence Bloody Mary. Mary views Elizabeth with suspicion. Elizabeth is Protestant, Anne Boleyn's daughter, raised in the new church. Elizabeth is also dangerously popular with the Protestant faction, who see her as their hope. In 1554, there's a Protestant rebellion against Mary. It fails, but Mary is convinced Elizabeth was involved. Elizabeth is arrested and sent to the Tower of London, the same place her mother was imprisoned before execution. Elizabeth knows exactly what this means. She's terrified she'll be executed, just like Anne. She writes a desperate letter to Mary, known as the Tide Letter, because the tide turned and she missed being sent to the Tower on time. She begs Mary to speak with her in person, to not execute her without proof of guilt. Mary refuses to see her. Elizabeth is imprisoned in the Tower for 2 months. She walks through the same courtyards where her mother walked. She may have been held in the same rooms. She's 20 years old and facing possible execution, but Mary can't prove Elizabeth was involved, and executing her could trigger another rebellion. So Mary eventually releases Elizabeth from the Tower and places her under house arrest in the countryside. Elizabeth spends the next 4 years walking a tightrope, staying loyal to Mary, attending Catholic Mass while privately remaining Protestant, avoiding any political entanglements, and praying Mary dies before she can manufacture a reason to execute her. Mary dies November 17, 1558, of cancer, possibly ovarian or uterine. Elizabeth is at Hatfield House when messengers arrive to inform her she's now Queen of England. According to legend, Elizabeth falls to her knees and quotes Psalm 118. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes." She's 25 years old. Think about what she survived to get here. Her mother's execution when she was barely old enough to remember, being declared bastard and stripped of everything. Years of neglect and poverty in various country houses, suspicion and imprisonment under Mary, literally held in the same tower where her mother died. Multiple plots and conspiracies swirling around her, the complete destruction of her mother's reputation, forcing her to pretend Anne never existed. And now she's Queen of England. Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child no one wanted, the girl declared illegitimate, the bastard of an executed traitor, is about to become the greatest monarch in English history. Elizabeth I reigns from 1558 to 1603, 45 years. In that time, she establishes England as a Protestant nation permanently. She defeats the Spanish Armada in 1588, the most powerful naval force in the world at the time. She presides over the English Renaissance, giving us Shakespeare, Marlowe and Spenser. English exploration and colonisation expand under her watch with figures like Raleigh and Drake. She never marries, maintaining her independence and England's autonomy. She develops the cult of Gloriana, presenting herself as the Virgin Queen married to England. She survives multiple assassination plots and threats of invasion, and she leaves England wealthier, more powerful, and more unified than it's been in centuries. This is the golden age of English history, and every bit of it vindicates Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was the driving force behind England's break with Rome. She promoted Protestant reformers, protected Protestant preachers, supported translation of the Bible into English, and pushed Henry toward Reformation theology. Elizabeth completes what Anne started. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 establishes a middle path, Protestant theology, but retaining some Catholic traditions. It's designed to prevent civil war between religious factions. It works. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, England is firmly Protestant. The Church of England becomes the foundation of English identity for centuries. Without Anne, there's no Elizabeth. Without Elizabeth, England might have returned to Catholicism under Mary and stayed that way. Anne's religious legacy, the thing that got her labelled heretic and contributed to her destruction, becomes the defining feature of English history. In 1588, England faces its greatest threat, the Spanish Armada. King Philip II of Spain, Mary I's widowed husband, a Catholic zealot, sends 130 ships to invade England, overthrow Elizabeth, and return the country to Catholicism. Elizabeth travels to Tilbury, where English troops are gathering, and delivers one of history's greatest speeches. "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." This is Anne Boleyn's daughter. Bold, defiant, refusing to be defined by the limitations society places on women. The Spanish Armada is defeated partly by English naval tactics, partly by storms Elizabeth calls the Protestant wind. Spain's power is broken. England emerges as a naval superpower. Elizabeth, the unwanted daughter, the bastard, the child of the executed traitor, just defeated the most powerful Catholic empire in the world. Elizabeth famously never marries. Politically, this is bizarre. Queens were expected to marry and produce heirs. Elizabeth's councillors beg her. Parliament petitions her. Foreign princes propose. She refuses everyone. Why? Historians debate, but one major factor, Elizabeth watched what happened to her mother. Anne Boleyn was queen and still ended up executed because she couldn't control her husband. She was subject to his whims, his desires, his political calculations. Elizabeth learns from this. Marriage means giving up control. If she marries a foreign prince, England becomes subject to that foreign power. If she marries an English noble, she triggers jealousy and faction fighting at court. The solution? Marry no one. Stay independent. Rule alone. Elizabeth develops the Virgin Queen persona, presenting herself as married to England, as a kind of secular Virgin Mary figure, devoted entirely to her country. Is this emotionally fulfilling? Probably not. Is it politically brilliant? Absolutely. Anne died because she was vulnerable as a wife. Elizabeth survives because she refuses to become one. We don't have records of Elizabeth speaking about Anne publicly. It was too dangerous for too long. But imagine what Elizabeth must have thought. My mother was executed when I was 2 years old for crimes she didn't commit. My father had her killed so he could marry another woman. I was declared a bastard, stripped of my title, forbidden from speaking her name. Everyone told me my mother was a whore, a traitor, a witch, and now I'm queen. Elizabeth's entire reign is a silent defence of Anne Boleyn. Every success Elizabeth achieves argues that Anne's blood was worth something, that Anne's intelligence and courage and political brilliance lived on in her daughter, that executing Anne didn't erase her, it just delayed her impact by a generation. Elizabeth can't publicly rehabilitate Anne. Too politically dangerous, would require admitting Henry was wrong. But she can prove Anne's legacy matters by being the greatest monarch England has ever seen. Anne Boleyn bet everything on her daughter's future. Elizabeth spends 45 years proving that bet was worth it. Let's talk about what happened to everyone who orchestrated Anne's murder, because karma is real, and Tudor England was particularly efficient at delivering it. Thomas Cromwell orchestrates Anne's downfall in April-May 1536. He gathers evidence, manufactures charges, stage manages trials, and watches Anne walk to scaffold. 4 years later, he walks to the same scaffold. By 1540, Cromwell has become too powerful for his own good. He's Henry's chief minister, controlling everything. He arranges Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a German princess, for political alliance. Problem: Henry finds Anne of Cleves physically repulsive. He calls her a Flanders mare and refuses to consummate the marriage. Henry blames Cromwell for tricking him. Cromwell's enemies at court, the Catholic faction, who have hated him for years, see their opportunity. They accuse Cromwell of treason and heresy. Same playbook Cromwell used against Anne, now used against him. Cromwell is arrested June 10, 1540. No trial, just a bill of attainder pushed through Parliament. He's executed July 28, 1540 at Tower Hill. The executioner is inexperienced, possibly drunk, and it takes multiple strokes to sever Cromwell's head. It's an agonising death, nothing like the clean stroke Anne received. As Cromwell is waiting for execution, he allegedly tells the crowd, "I die in the Catholic faith," trying to refute the heresy charges even as he's dying. Some accounts from the period claim that in his final days, Henry VIII expressed regret for executing Cromwell and Anne, realising Cromwell had been useful and Anne had been innocent. But regret comes too late. Both are dead. Henry VIII dies January 28, 1547, at age 55. By the end, he's grotesquely obese, estimated over 300 pounds, 54-inch waist. He can't walk. He has to be carried in a chair or moved with mechanical lifts. His leg ulcer from old jousting injury is infected and oozing pus constantly. He likely has type 2 diabetes, possibly syphilis. His breath reeks. He's in constant pain. He's married and divorced or executed 6 wives. Catherine of Aragon was first divorced and left to die in poverty. Then Anne Boleyn, executed. Jane Seymour came next and died after childbirth. Anne of Cleves survived by being smart enough to agree to an annulment. Catherine Howard followed and was executed for adultery, probably actually guilty this time. Finally, Catherine Parr, who survived Henry, but only barely. His paranoia is legendary by the end. He trusts no one. He executes friends, advisors, wives, cousins. The court is a nightmare of terror, where anyone could be arrested at any moment. French explorer André Thevet writes in 1575 that English gentlemen told him Henry expressed fine repentance on his deathbed for the injustice and crime committed against the said Queen Anne Boleyn, falsely vanquished and accused. Too late, Henry. 11 years too late. A memorial document at the British Library states, "The King acknowledges with great grief at his death the injuries he had done to the Lady Anne Boleyn and her daughter." If this is true, and we can't be certain, then Henry died knowing he murdered an innocent woman and destroyed his daughter's childhood for nothing. The son he wanted so desperately, Edward, reigns only 6 years and dies young. The daughter he didn't want, Elizabeth, becomes the greatest English monarch in history. Henry destroyed Anne for nothing. Absolutely nothing. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Anne's uncle who presided over her trial, is one of history's great political survivors. He convicts his own niece to save himself. He stays in Henry's favour by being useful and keeping his head down. But in 1546, Norfolk's son, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, is arrested for treason. Surrey is executed January 1547. Norfolk is arrested too and condemned to death. He's scheduled to be executed January 28, 1547. That's the day Henry VIII dies. Executions are postponed during transition of power. By the time anyone remembers Norfolk is sitting in the Tower under sentence of death, it's been months. Edward VI's Regency Council decides to just leave him there. Norfolk spends the entirety of Edward's reign, 1547-1553, imprisoned in the Tower. He's released when Mary takes power in 1553 because he's Catholic, and Mary needs Catholic allies. Norfolk dies in 1554 of natural causes in his bed. The man who condemned Anne Boleyn escapes execution 3 times and dies old and wealthy. Sometimes karma doesn't work fast enough. Charles Brandon, Henry's best friend, the guy who vocally pushed for Anne's conviction, dies August 22nd, 1545. He's not executed or murdered. He dies of illness, possibly the sweating sickness that periodically devastated England. But here's the karmic twist. His sons die young too, both of them, within a year of his death. The Brandon line, Henry's closest friend's family, essentially ends. Henry Howard, Surrey, marries Brandon's daughter, but Surrey is executed for treason in 1547. Brandon's legacy crumbles, his wealth dispersed, his name fades. The woman he helped destroy, her daughter becomes the greatest queen in English history. Here's the unfair part. Jane Seymour's family does well. Her brothers, Edward Seymour and Thomas Seymour, both become powerful during Edward VI's reign. Edward Seymour becomes Lord Protector, essentially ruling England as regent for the young king, but even they don't escape Tudor destruction forever. Thomas Seymour is executed in 1549 for treason, after he tries to marry Elizabeth and overthrow his brother. Edward Seymour follows him to the block in 1552, also for treason. Everyone who gets close to Tudor power eventually burns. Let's come back to Anne's letter. The one written May 6, 1536, the one Henry probably never read, the one that didn't save her. Why does it matter? Because Anne Boleyn understood something that most people facing death don't. You can lose the battle and still win the war. When Anne sat down to write that letter, she knew several things. Henry had already decided to execute her. The trials were predetermined. She couldn't save herself, but she could shape her legacy. The letter isn't really begging for mercy. Look at it again. She barely asks for her life. What she asks for instead is a fair trial, knowing she won't get one, but creating a historical record of demanding it. She begs mercy for the falsely accused men, demonstrating moral authority and queenly compassion. She asserts recognition of her innocence repeatedly for future readers, and she fights to protect her reputation so Elizabeth won't grow up as the daughter of a proven traitor. The letter is a time capsule. Anne is writing for 1540 when it's found, for 1558 when Elizabeth becomes queen, for 1600s historians. For us, in 2025, she's creating documentation of her innocence that will outlive the propaganda of 1536. Anne makes 3 brilliant moves in this letter, and they're all interwoven so cleverly you might miss them. She never directly attacks Henry. She criticises Your Grace's enemies and suggests Henry is being manipulated, but she never says, "You are a tyrant murdering an innocent woman." Why? Because that would endanger Elizabeth. If Anne curses Henry publicly, Elizabeth becomes the daughter of a woman who cursed the king on her way to execution. That marks Elizabeth as disloyal, dangerous, someone who can't be trusted. So Anne protects Elizabeth by protecting Henry's reputation. Even while knowing he's killing her, Anne writes carefully to ensure nothing she says can be used against her daughter later. Then there's how she asserts innocence without seeming aggressive. Let not your grace ever imagine that your poor wife will ever be brought to acknowledge a fault, where never not so much as a thought thereof ever proceeded. She's saying, I'm innocent, but framing it as begging Henry not to imagine otherwise. It's assertion disguised as entreaty. This is rhetorically brilliant. If she just says, I'm innocent repeatedly, she sounds defensive. If she frames it as, don't imagine I'm guilty, she's asking Henry for something, his trust, while proclaiming innocence. And finally, she creates multiple narratives for different audiences, all in the same letter. For Henry, if he reads it, there's emotional appeal, reminder of their love, subtle guilt tripping. For Cromwell and the council, there's demonstration that she knows this is orchestrated. For posterity, there's clear documentation of demanding fair trial and asserting innocence. For Elizabeth's future, there's protection through careful word choices. One letter, 4 different strategic purposes. This is why Anne Boleyn was so dangerous to men like Cromwell. She thought 3 moves ahead. She understood rhetoric, politics, emotion, and legacy simultaneously. The letter didn't save Anne's life, but it achieved its real purpose. It ensured Anne Boleyn would not be forgotten as guilty. Throughout centuries after 1536, historians debate Anne's guilt, but the letter, along with flimsy evidence, speed of trials, contradictions in dates, convinces most serious historians Anne was innocent. By 1600s, scholars are questioning the verdict. By 1800s, most historians believe Anne was framed. By 1900s, it's consensus. Anne Boleyn was innocent, victim of political coup. Today, there's no serious historical debate. Everyone knows Anne was murdered by Henry to marry Jane Seymour, and that Cromwell orchestrated it. The letter is part of why we know this. It's evidence of Anne's state of mind. Calm, rational, politically savvy, asserting innocence. It's evidence of her demanding fair trial. It's evidence of her nobility in begging for lives of others. Most importantly, it's evidence that Anne knew she was being framed and said so directly. Here's the ultimate victory of Anne Boleyn's strategy. 500 years later, we remember Anne. We forget most of her enemies. Ask random people who Thomas Cromwell was, most won't know. Ask who Charles Brandon was, blank stares. Ask who Jane Seymour was. One of Henry's wives? Ask who Anne Boleyn was. Everyone knows. She's been portrayed in dozens of films, TV shows, novels, plays. She's one of the most recognisable historical figures in English history. She's iconic, and importantly, most people know she was innocent. Pop culture, historians, documentaries all agree Anne was framed and murdered. She's portrayed sympathetically, as intelligent, brave, victim of misogynistic Tudor politics. Anne Boleyn won the long game. She died at 35, executed on false charges, buried in arrow chest in unmarked grave. But her daughter became queen. Her religious reforms reshaped England. Her intelligence and courage inspired centuries of women who saw in Anne someone who refused to be silenced, even facing death. And that letter, written in prison cell, with 13 days left to live, probably never read by its intended recipient, became part of her vindication. Sometimes, losing the battle is how you win the war. So what do we take from Anne Boleyn's story? From that letter written in darkness, from a life destroyed for politics, from a legacy that outlasted her executioners? Anne Boleyn was executed partly because she was too smart. She could debate theology with bishops. She spoke multiple languages. She read banned books. She had political opinions. She challenged the king in private and sometimes in public. This made her dangerous. In a world where women were supposed to be silent, obedient, and decorative, Anne was loud, defiant, and substantive. The charges against her, adultery, incest, treason, were fabricated. But the real crime? Being a woman who refused to know her place. 500 years later, this is still relevant. Women who are too ambitious, too outspoken, too intelligent, still face punishment, maybe not execution, but social destruction, career sabotage, reputational assassination. Anne Boleyn's story is a reminder that threatening the status quo has always been dangerous, especially for women. Anne couldn't save her life, but she could control how history remembered her. Every move she made in those final days, the letter to Henry, the letter to Matthew Parker, her clothing choices, her scaffold speech, her dignity, was calculated to shape her legacy. She played for posterity, and it worked. We remember Anne as intelligent, brave, and innocent. We remember her as a woman destroyed by politics, not as a guilty criminal. Your ending doesn't define your story. How you face your ending does. Anne barely mentioned Elizabeth in her final letter. That silence was strategic, to protect her daughter from association with a condemned traitor. Every word Anne spoke on the scaffold praised Henry, to protect Elizabeth from retaliation. Anne's final acts weren't about herself. They were about securing whatever future she could for her child. True strength isn't saving yourself. It's protecting what matters when you can't save yourself. Anne Boleyn couldn't win. If she'd stayed Henry's mistress, she'd have been discarded like her sister. When she demanded marriage, she was called a manipulative seductress. When she became queen, she was expected to be perfect, producing male heirs while being submissive but interesting, influential but not too political, intelligent but not threatening. When she failed to produce sons, biologically beyond her control, she became disposable. The system was designed so she couldn't win. That's the point of systems that protect power. They make it impossible for threats to succeed no matter what they do. This is still true. Systems of power, political, corporate, social, are designed to crush people who threaten them. And those people often can't win by playing the game. Sometimes the only move is to refuse to play and accept the consequences while maintaining dignity and truth. In 1536, England was flooded with propaganda about Anne Boleyn. She was a witch, an adulteress, a traitor. She'd bewitched the king. She'd betrayed her country. Everyone believed it, had to believe it. Questioning it was treason. But slowly, over centuries, the truth emerged. Historians examined evidence. They found contradictions, impossibilities, signs of fabrication. Today, we know Anne was innocent. Lies can dominate in the moment, but truth persists if anyone bothers to look. Anne couldn't make 1536 England believe her, but she could leave enough evidence that 1700, 1900, 2025 would believe her. Play the long game. Truth is patient. Anne Boleyn's letter to Henry VIII wasn't about Henry. It was about us, future readers, people who would look back and wonder, what really happened? Was she guilty? How did she face death? The letter answers, I was innocent. I faced death with courage. I protected others even knowing I couldn't save myself. I refused to confess to crimes I didn't commit, and I played for posterity, not the present. That letter, found in Cromwell's papers after he too was executed, preserved by accident or design, reaches across 5 centuries to tell us: you can be destroyed by power and still not be defeated. You can lose everything and still win. You can be silenced in your time and still speak to future generations. Anne Boleyn wrote her last letter knowing it probably wouldn't save her. She was right, it didn't, but it saved her legacy. It protected her daughter. It told the truth to anyone willing to listen. And 500 years later, we're still reading it, still learning from it, still inspired by a woman who faced execution with intelligence, strategy, and a refusal to go quietly into history as guilty. Anne Boleyn's last letter wasn't about begging for mercy. It was about refusing to be erased. And in that, she succeeded beyond anything she could have imagined. Her daughter became Elizabeth of Ut. Her religious reforms shaped England for centuries. Her story became legendary. Her name became synonymous with intelligence, courage, and the brutal unfairness of women who dare to be extraordinary. The executioner took Anne Boleyn's head on May 19, 1536, but he couldn't take her voice. That voice still speaks, in letters written in prison cells, in histories written by sympathetic scholars, in films and books and documentaries, in every woman who refuses to confess to crimes she didn't commit, in every person who plays for legacy rather than immediate survival. Anne Boleyn lost her life, but she won her war, and that letter, written in darkness, found in the papers of her enemy, read by generations who came after, is proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one that saves you. It's the one that ensures you'll never be forgotten. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember, Anne Boleyn sat in a prison cell 500 years ago with ink-stained fingers and 13 days left to live. And she chose to write truth instead of lies, strategy instead of desperation, legacy instead of mercy. And because of that choice, we're still talking about her. Rest well, everyone. And if you enjoyed tonight's journey through history, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? And most importantly, do you think Anne's letter was an act of desperation or brilliant political strategy? I'll see you in the next one. Sweet dreams.